So I am so privileged to have Dr. Lauster and Dr. Christian with me tonight. I've known Dr. Christian for years, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know Dr. Lauster in the last couple of years. My background is in clinical psychology. I have a doctorate from Case Western Reserve University. I spent the past, I would say, decade working at one of the independent schools in Cleveland at a high school level, working a lot with teenagers. So the topic of social media is something I feel very familiar with over the past decade. And then in the past year, I also opened a practice with offices in Beechwood and Hudson.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Kelly Christian. I'm also a clinical psychologist. Found my way to Cleveland because I also went to Case Western as well. Primarily, I specialize in psychological assessment, kids 4 through like college age. Um, and that's really like where like my passion is, I would say. I also do a lot of consultation with families. So like questions like this come up all the time, like what the heck do I do? I'm worried about limit setting. My kid's freaking out. I need breaks, that kind of thing. So I like to work with families in that way too. So I'm primarily at the Lawrence School, which is a school for kids with learning disabilities like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and ADHD as well. And we also have children there who are also on the spectrum. So that's where I am normally. And then one day a week, I'm in Beechwood in a private practice. So.
My name's Dr. Emily Lauster. I work with Dr. Christian at the Schafer Center at the Lawrence School. And I'm a newly licensed clinical psychologist, so I literally just finished school. Um, but I'm doing my postdoctorate year at the Schafer Center, and I'll be staying on there next year. But I, you know, primarily also do psychological and psychoeducational assessment, and I also do a lot of therapy with kids and teens. So my background is primarily with kids and teens, and I got my doctorate at the University of Denver. I'm originally from here, so I made my way back, and I'm excited to join in on the conversation tonight.
But we're going to do about 15 to 20 minutes of slides. We'll talk a little bit about the impact and current research, which of course is like, it's always updating and changing, but the technology on today's youth is obviously why you're all here. We'll focus quite a bit on social media, but also on things like video games, iPad use, texting. And because of the audience tonight, I think we can really personalize it a little bit to your questions as well. So after slides, we're going to do what's a moderated Q&A. We have some pre-submitted questions that we know come up quite a bit. And you'll notice that there's also some slides talking about things like fostering independence, creating boundaries. Those are topics we're planning to go into in the moderated Q&A. And then we'll end with the last like 20 to 30 minutes being an open Q&A where you guys get to just ask any questions you want. Okay. So I promise this is the only slide I will read tonight. I don't typically read slides, but for the purpose of impact, I do think it's an important one. So I want to acknowledge how hard it is to be a parent these days, or a teacher, a school administrator, a coach, or anyone else who works with children and adolescents. It's even harder to be an adolescent. We're all trying to do our best while struggling with incomplete knowledge about a rapidly changing technological world that is fragmenting our attention and changing our relationships. It's hard for us to understand what is happening or know exactly what to do about it, but we must do something. We must try new policies and measure the outcomes. Jonathan Haidt wrote a pretty famous book you might have heard of this year called The Anxious Generation. So we're going to talk today. I think this sets the stage. Interestingly, I'm a huge fan of balance. You'll hear it a lot in the way I talk tonight, and probably a little bit of the way we talk in the moderated Q&A. But I do think there's something to be said for the fact that we know children and adolescents are struggling with anxiety, depression, and other challenges at a greater level than they were a decade or two ago. We do have some research on that. Now, whether it's social media or whether social media is one small piece, which I suspect it's one piece of a larger puzzle, it's still really important for us to talk about it and what to do with it. Because as you all noted when you came in here, you're seeing the changes, perhaps, as you noted, from when we grew up to how kids are growing up today, right? And how do we make sense of that? And what do we do with that can help provide that balance we're trying to seek? Okay. An overview of data. So the data is really interesting, right? Because I think you can look at research and you can find research that supports any view that you're probably looking for. And so I also always kind of look at this in an approach that is both understanding of aspects of it, but critical of perhaps some others. When we look at the research right now about social media use, what it seems to show is that there is some kind of correlation, not causation, but some sort of correlation between very high use of social media and anxiety and depression. It's plausible that one is causing the other, but it's just as plausible that kids who are anxious and depressed are also then leaning into social media as a means of coping, right? And I know there was a lot last year when the US Surgeon General's warning came out about social media. And if you read it, it clearly does state that it recognizes the potential benefits and many indicators of risk. But when we look at it a little more closely, what it's also looking at when it's doing this assessment is a lot of the research is based on kids and teens who are using social media almost constantly. And that's actually the phrase that is used like a Likert scale. Now, when I think about that, I also imagine that there's almost nothing that I could use in a constant manner that would probably be very good for me, right? So what's tricky about the data right now is we don't have a lot of evidence of like, what does it look like if a kid is only on video games or social media a couple hours a day, right? I'll be very curious to see when and how that research comes out. Because I think right now it's hard to know exactly what the data is because it's so muddied by other factors, right? Now, the other piece, there's the Pew research has come out and said about 46% of young individuals, of teens, are experiencing cyberbullying as of 2022. We're going to talk a little bit about what cyberbullying looks like, the ways in which it differs from how we grew up with bullying, perhaps in person or relational aggression, and what we can do about that piece as well. Okay. Actually, before I go into the data, I think it's always helpful. I have this one story, and I think it really sets the stage for kind of what we're talking about tonight. So I get the great pleasure of working with lots of teens and kids and families, but this one really stands out for the topic of this evening. I was working a couple years ago with a 14-year-old who was a freshman in high school. She was adjusting to a new school, which would have on its own been a lot. Yeah, the first year of high school tends to be a lot. But in addition to that, she was an only child living at home with her two parents. And in the fall of her freshman year, it was determined that her uncle, who lived in a foreign country at the time, needed medical treatment and was going to move in with them for, at the time, like an undisclosed amount of time to get medical treatment here in the United States. Uncle does not speak English. He only speaks dad's native language, which daughter she was not fluent in any way. So as a 14-year-old girl who's new to high school and peers and a rigorous academic environment, she now, and has always been an only child in her home, she now is adjusting to someone living with her, which was a pretty big, kind of a pretty big life quake at the time. And she does what naturally, I think a lot of 14-year-olds who are kind and compassionate like this young woman would do. She uses a lot of nonverbal gestures, right? So a lot of eye contact, a lot of warm smiles, a lot of like open gestures. And that strategy is pretty effective in at least getting across that she's warm and inviting and welcoming to this uncle that she doesn't actually know. But being that it's at the time like 2023, she also has another tool at her disposal, and that is Google Translate, right? So she would use her phone and she would say a sentence and Google Translate would translate it, and then she would hand it to the uncle and he would say a sentence, and they would communicate back and forth like this. And it actually worked pretty well for two people who didn't know each other's languages, right? And I think in that moment, or like that example is kind of one of those ways in which we can learn a little bit about the incredible benefits that it can have, digital technology can have when used in certain situations. But also then there's the other piece. So this same 14-year-old girl who is adjusting to major changes is not uncommonly finding that she's on social media a ton, right? When she actually looks at the data, she's on social media like 6 or 7 hours a day. And she recognizes that she doesn't feel great about that number. I think she was surprised when she actually learned how much time she was spending on social media. And more importantly, even though she realistically knew that the influencers and the pictures she was seeing were largely filtered or unrealistic or artificially generated, it didn't quite matter that she knew that, because on some level, she still felt like when she was flooded with these images that she didn't measure up. She was not as beautiful as the influencers. Her life didn't look like this. It wasn't nearly as fun, even as sometimes the other peers in her grade or at her former 8th grade class were posting. Because that's what social media is often. It's like a highlight reel, and a very curated one. So in working with her, you know, I'm sure one of the things we did is something that you would all naturally think to do, which is like, let's put some limits on social media. Let's put time limits on it, which you can easily do on your phone. Now she can at any time choose to ignore the limits and stay on it longer, but then she's at least aware of how long she's spending time on it, which is important, because otherwise you can be spending, sometimes you're not monitoring how long you're on it. And the other piece we really consciously did was I kind of framed it as an experiment for her to get some buy-in, but we asked her to unfollow some people for a while. Like, let's unfollow some influencers. Let's pare it down to people you know in real life. Let's pare it down to, like, maybe there's a couple sports athletes that feel really inspirational. Great. And then let's follow up and see how you're feeling once you don't have this in your feed every day. But as you might also guess, if this young woman was spending 6 or 7 hours a day on social media, and now we're paring it down significantly, what else is she going to do to fill that time? That is such an important component here, and one that when we think about data or we think about research, I'm not particularly concerned about a kid who is spending a couple hours a day in the digital world, as long as they also have real life experiences. So this young woman was kind of on the shy side. She had done theater when she was a kid, didn't want to do theater, but she did get involved. She was like, I can do like set design. I can do costume design. She ended up loving it. And by sheer luck, this will never happen again in my career, I am sure. A teacher at the school found that there was a like singing and dancing and cooking club in the community, not at the school, that was of the culture of her dad and uncle, which just happened to be like this incredible experience that she did. She bonded with her dad, she bonded with her uncle a little bit. I'm sure the chances of that happening in my career again seem pretty low. But it does go to show that it's not just about taking away the social media or the digital devices or the texting or the video games, whatever we want to refer to. It's also about how are we replacing it with something that feels meaningful or purposeful or enriching in some way. And so when I work with teens and or families, I think that's always the approach I'm trying to take, of like, there's some strengths to any of it. There's some cons to any of it. And being aware and mindful of that is going to be the most important component. And then we continue to adjust as the kids age, as the technology changes. That's what's often exhausting for parents and for educators and for family and for providers like ourselves, is it does require a lot of like tweaking and adjustment as things change and as your own kids change. And then, so it's not lost on me that this young woman was 14. That could have also easily happened to an 18-year-old. And I think the outcome of those life adjustments would have been similar, right? Like anytime anyone's moving into your home, that would be an adjustment. But really, when we're often talking about kids' use of social media or getting their own phone, it often corresponds with a very critical stage of development, right? Which most of us know as puberty. But we know that puberty and the ages of about, so puberty is a smidge higher than this, but the sensitive period for social learning happens around 9 years old to 15 years old. Now, we're always social beings, so we're learning from the day we're born all the way till the very end. But like this massive brain development in terms of social learning is happening around 9 to 15 years old, which happens to correlate with the time when a lot of kids are using video games, their tablets more and more often at school, maybe getting into social media if we're talking about the middle school age and above. And so yeah, this is that critical stage is when we're really seeing a lot of changes in the amygdala, which is the like emotion center of the brain. That's where we learn how to regulate our emotions. And the prefrontal cortex, which many of you might recognize as the executive functioning center of the brain. So we know that neither of those are developed until like early 20s, fully developed. But this is when we're seeing a lot of changes in the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, also during a time when kids are kind of being bombarded with a lot of information. And they're a little bit prone to being impulsive at this age. And I think what's slightly different is, all of us learned social skills in a slightly different way than kids are doing it now. Maybe, obviously there were like phones and you could call someone on your kitchen phone and oh, hi, we have another attendant. And that would be like a real-time phone conversation. But for most of us, everything we learned was probably done in person most of the time. And that's really drastically different than what kids are doing right now. Sometimes they're actually so afraid of having the difficult or maybe like uncomfortable moments in real life that they're deferring to doing it via text message or avoiding it altogether. And that's some of the pieces that we really want to be thinking about as parents, as educators, as psychologists and mental health providers. So when we think about virtual experiences, so now we're kind of talking about all of it, video games, social media, texting. One of the major pros is definitely that it increases flexibility for communication, right? This idea that my client student a couple of years ago was able to use Google Translate to connect with someone that she cared about who was living in her home and not speaking her language, that's an incredible tool and resource. There's no doubt about it. The fact that we could connect via FaceTime during a pandemic with people when we couldn't see them in person for a while, it's certainly better than nothing. There are ways in which, as someone earlier had mentioned, there's incredible educational opportunities to do learning and feedback in real time with some of these programs that are being developed and used by schools and by educators. So there's no doubt that there are ways in which it's an incredible resource and tool. And it's worth teaching our kids how to use it responsibly. This is the world they're going to be living in. There's also data that really does suggest that for certain subsets of kids, there are affinity spaces in social media where they, or the idea of a kid who might be so introverted that they want to connect with peers, and it's easier to do that over a video game. There's some merit to that, and there's certainly merit to certain communities having spaces on social media that may not be available in person to them, such as the LGBTQ community for teens growing up. But I will say, in working for such a long time with high schoolers, the number one thing that does concern me when we talk about social media or text messaging and like the group chats is that when we were growing up, if we had said something in this space of like we're all socially learning as adolescents, and we said something that didn't land right or didn't land well, we would immediately get that feedback because we would see it on the faces of like the 4 kids around us. We would register that really quickly and go, oh, I'm sorry, or that came out wrong. And we'd do something to repair it in the moment. And it would probably be done and over with in like a few minutes and everyone would move on. And without a doubt, all of us have made those mistakes as we're growing up. Like that's part of human nature. That's part of the experience of growing up. But what's happening today and what I see with high schoolers is, you know, you have an impulsive moment, you post something online, whether it's a picture, whether it's a comment, it can be misconstrued, it can be misunderstood, and the stakes feel so much higher, right? Everything has greater permanency and the audience is much wider. Suddenly it's passed around from one person that you texted this thing to like a larger group of people. That's really tricky. And this other aspect that I undoubtedly you all are aware of too, is that when you're looking through a screen at content or input, it feels less personal. And it is so easy for us to get into really dichotomous thinking about that. Maybe not us adults as much, but certainly for teens and kids who might be younger. So that comment that someone makes or that post that someone makes, here's how it plays out in real life, right? A kid is looking at all of this content on their feed, whether it's social, usually we're talking about social media in these moments. This person's great, this person's awful. I like this, I hate this. This person's my hero, that person's canceled. And this happens rapid fire because their brains are trying to categorize things really quickly. But it leaves like no room for the situational nuance that happens in real time with kids who are growing up and making mistakes and like how do we repair, and those are really critical skill, like life skills that we do want to continue to make sure that our kids are understanding and experiencing in real life. And that can get really easily lost in the online world of like, well, that kid said that one thing and now like I'm never going to talk to them again. And if your kid is on the receiving end of it, it can be so damaging. Even if it was something, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that could have been said and misconstrued. But even for the kids who are doing the quick categorization, it's a missed opportunity for learning empathy, right? And that is such a critical skill that I think sometimes as a society we all need to continue to work on is having empathy for others and like learning how to repair and grow. And most of us learn that probably during adolescence. And then real world experiences. So there's a lot of talk, particularly in that book, The Anxious Generation, which is really famous, about this like shift in culture or phones as an experience blocker and like under preparing, under supervising kids in the digital world and over protecting them in the real world. And I think part of that is that what's interesting about technology is that it's so rapidly changing that the kids often understand it better than we do as parents, right? It's hard for us to keep up, whether that's from a parent perspective, whether that's a grandparent perspective, a school administrator, whether that's a mental health provider. The kids seem to have a better grasp on it. And as soon as we feel like we have a good handle, it's kind of adjusting again. And so one of the things we really do want to think about, in addition to like, how do we help them create and have spaces to build real world communication, is also, where was I here? Oh, yes, is making sure that we do have real world experiences for them. And it doesn't always have to be the structured things. It doesn't always have to be a sport or a game or a club. It really can be free play. But also recognizing that part of what's going to be so critical here, and we're going to talk about it, is that just open dialogue with our kids and teens and learning to set boundaries. And then as kids mature, we're going to have to shift and navigate a new boundary or a new, what I sometimes call is like a digital curfew, because that's the best way at the moment to respond to everything that's shifting so quickly in this digital world space. And so I'm going to turn it over to a moderated conversation in a minute, but I think there was one other comparison that when we did this talk before, it really stood out to me, is I think there's a lot of conversation about how the kids don't seem all right today, in today's day and age. And if you look at the statistics on anxiety and depression, that it doesn't look great, I would agree. And all of us are quite busy, so that probably says something about how mental health is going. But when I think about it a little bit, I have to have some optimism that maybe something else is happening. So for those of you who have ever known or maybe worked with someone who is a bilingual language learner, there is this pattern that happens when they are young. If you are learning two languages at the same time, often that infant or young toddler seems delayed for a while. It takes them longer to, not every kid, but we do see this pattern happening. But then when they do start to speak, they really, like, they just take off. Like, they really flourish and they're pretty fluent. If they learn it from a young age, they're really fluent in both languages. It's incredible. And I think to myself a little bit that maybe the delays we're seeing, it wouldn't explain for the anxiety and depression, but maybe when we think about the social skills delays that I know are being discussed in schools and in forums on a national level, maybe part of it is that we're asking these kids to learn two languages at once, right? We all learned social skills in the real world. And I am going to imagine that you all felt like me. I thought that was really hard at the time. I still, looking back, think that was hard as an adolescent. But these kids are learning to do it in two different ways. And I wonder to myself if that might have something to do with, like, maybe they're trying to navigate social skills in both and they're making a lot of mistakes and they're making a lot of errors, because that's what would happen with anyone who's trying to learn two languages at once. But if they can master that, which I have no doubt they eventually will, then maybe they'll really flourish, because we need them to be good at digital communication. That's the direction that connects everyone in the world. But we also need them to have really strong real world relationships and to build healthy adult relationships, which is all of the social skills they learn in real time. So that, I don't know, maybe that's my theory. That's my optimistic view of things. But I will leave you with that food for thought, and we'll do like a moderated Q&A of questions.
Based on what we know, should we just ban all phones and video games before high school? Would that solve the problem?
Well, I think, you know, one, I think it's just incredibly impossible. Like, it just would be incredibly hard to do that prior to high school. And I think that question lends itself to what we're also noticing is, like, anytime we introduce something, like, there's going to be this learning curve that's really hard right away. And so, I think going, as I think it's Lisa D'Amour, who's fantastic, by the way, who says, like, go slow. Isn't that what she says? Like, go slow and take your time. I think that makes a lot of sense when we're talking about things like social media. But banning it altogether, like, there are many kids who probably use video games as a means of connecting. And I think as long as they're doing that in addition to connecting in real world time, I don't see that as necessarily a problem. I think there's a far bigger issue if we try to ban everything and then kids feel, I think kids feel restricted and limited.
Just like dieting.
Yeah. And then they just binge it later, right? So I think that would probably actually make things more problematic than having dialogue along the way and, like, adjusting our expectations around it.
All right, so this one is for Dr. Kelly. Let's say you're a parent who is just beginning the journey of accessing digital media with their child. What should parents think about to set their child up for a healthy relationship with screens and screen time? And is there such a thing as healthy social media use?
Great question. So, are any of you familiar with the American Academy of Pediatrics website? It's the Center for Excellence on Social Media and Mental Health. Have any of you accessed that? It is a fantastic resource. So it's Center for Excellence on Social Media and Youth Mental Health. They have really done the work of figuring out what helps children and parents come together around, like, digital interactions, and it's incredible to me that they have all these guides for how you start to set up the conversation around social and digital use. So, like, for a lot of younger kids, it's YouTube, right? And then as they get older, then you might be doing more social media pieces. But YouTube is huge among younger children, including my own, who's 6. Like, he's obsessed and it's hard to pry him away, right? So Originally, I was a little like put off because I was like, what? There's a 0 to 6 month guide? And I'm like, oh, well, some people might need that, right? Because I remember when I had my baby shower, I was gifted all these like DVDs of baby Einstein. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to put this on TV. I was very adamant about like no screens before too.
I was too, and then I had a baby. And he was 2 months old.
I held off for a long time, and then he was like 18 months right at like March 2020, and I was like, okay, I guess I gotta get you to do something so I can check my email.
There you go.
But yes, so I think the big thing to know is that these conversations really need to start early and often. Probably not 6 months, but like early and often, and that starts even like when they're watching Daniel Tiger and they're 3 years old, and you're talking about like what good content this is. You're sharing the songs and the stories. There's also like a place for connection between you and your child. And the content itself is strong, right? It's like teaching social emotional lessons and also helping kids just know like how do I come back from a setback, right? So like basically I'm a huge fan of PBS. So anything prior to kindergarten, like PBS is where it's at. So if your content is good, that's great. The other thing to think about, which I think this like resource, this American Academy of Pediatrics resource focuses on, is also your own child. So if you have a child who has ADHD and you're prone to saying, I'm going to click on this YouTube video, but it looks terrifying as a parent, you don't want them reaching out to that. That's where like I got to put some more guardrails around like YouTube time. So YouTube was only on when you're there to watch them, or YouTube is only on after you've gone through and you've blocked a ton of stuff, right? And we are lucky that I guess I'm not sure how long YouTube Kids has been out, but it's been out long enough that I know that it at least like screens out a lot of crummy, scary stuff for your kid to land on. But the idea is like getting to know your child and figuring out what they're prone to getting into. Can you make sure the content they're reaching is appropriate, right? I think that's huge and important. And then also, if you need to, if you're concerned about certain things, like Common Sense Media is all about providing opinions on like video games, videos, movies, that kind of thing, about what's appropriate for a specific age. And then I think if you like go to the trouble of like signing up, you can also throw in there if there's any like neurodevelopmental concerns as well to help them let you know like what video games are most appropriate, right? Because like right now, like day 1 of kindergarten, my kid was like, what's Minecraft? Day 2, he was telling me all about Minecraft. Day 3, why can't I play Minecraft, right? So there's like a lot of push for things like that. And it's like, well, wait, let me figure out what this even is, because I'm not going to just like give it to you. And so that's where that like slow and steady like comes in. Like it's really hard to reel kids back in once you've given them, permission to do certain things. But, I still think it's important. Like there are times where I've made mistakes, of course, where I've had my kid watch YouTube Kids in the car, but I'm driving. And so I don't know what he's looking at. And all of a sudden I'm like, what does that sound? What are you watching? And so then that needs to come with a conversation after, like, I made a mistake, or we're not doing this anymore, and here's why. I think the other key thing to think about, especially when you're having kids with meltdowns around taking away a device, is just having frank conversations about this is what it's meant to do. It's meant to hook you in and not let you turn it off. And it's awful feeling. And then trying to figure out with them, like, how do I get you out of this like loop, right? Because a lot of like the research talks about like the dopamine loop. Have you guys heard about that? Like the dopamine loop. And when you see this stuff, especially video games, it's all like, it's just telling your brain, this is yummy, keep going at it. Here's more jelly beans, like go, 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 And to break that cycle is really hard for them, and just helping them know, like, I know this will be hard. Let's figure out how this won't be so hard, because guess what, buddy? If we don't figure it out, you can't have this. Right? You're not ready for it yet. And so those conversations do, I think, need to happen early, and they also have to happen often. because especially I heard a lot of people in here have 6, 7, 8 year olds that they're caring for. And that age, they're just primed for information. Like that little brain of theirs is just like, gimme, 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 gimme. And so, in some ways, like you can use these like things as tools, right? Digital media for tools, um, and can teach you how to read, like beautiful things like that. And I think where it's hard for parents is that we then have to step in, set the guidelines, keep the guidelines in place, and also recognize just how hard it is for them. Then, as a parent, we have to be mindful of our own like use of technology because I know I'm, guilty of this. Like, let me check one more email, let me check one more text message, let me, get back to somebody else on something. I need to add something to my calendar so I don't forget. Like, and it's really hard to rein it in, but you have to carve out that time where that is not interfering with your own child and your interactions with them. But I also recognize that's hard because none of us, like, we're expected to work 24/7 nowadays. So as much as we can, like, work towards like finding content that is appropriate for their age, monitoring them, especially when it's new, um, would be important. And then, yeah, using tools and resources at your disposal that will help your child understand like the purpose of this stuff is like to sell you ads and to get you to watch longer and that kind of thing. Sometimes they're like, wait, what? Like they're doing this for me on purpose, and then they realize that's kind of an icky thing, and they're a little more interested in backing off a little bit. But yeah, I would definitely like utilize like the American Academy of Pediatrics website. They have a Q&A portal that's really helpful. So they have people submit questions, kids submit questions. So if like your nephews, you can be like, let's write them and ask them something. They'll get back to you and they'll tell, and these are like the experts in this field of pediatrics, and give them some hints. They love getting kid questions. That's what I heard. So yeah. And then there's something else I was going to say. Maybe I'll think of it later. Yeah, I'll think of it later probably. But yeah, that's what I would say. The early and often conversations are important. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, Dr. Emily, this one's for you. What are the signs you see in families you work with that trigger for you, or work with that trigger for you that the child, you are working with has an unhealthy relationship with social media, video games, and screen time?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. And I work with a lot of kids, sort of in the age group that I think a lot of you are sharing, your kiddos are in. And, unhealthy relationship kind of like that's a broad category, right? I mean, I think that can span a lot of different things. But I think often the sort of question that I get from parents is like, is it unhealthy? Like, is what I'm observing actually unhealthy or is it something else? Is this normal? And usually, like, my first question is like, when kiddo is going towards devices, social media, video games, is it serving some kind of function? And like, what is the function, right? Because if we're always going to it when we're sad or when we're upset or something happened at school and we don't want to talk about it and we're trying to escape, like, that's really important information. Are we always going to it when we're bored because we don't know how to sit with ourselves and our thoughts? Also a really important conversation. And, equally, like, if we're spending time with friends and the only thing that we're doing when we're in person with that friend is this thing, is that 100% bad? Not necessarily, but again, I would be curious about like, why, right? Like, what's getting in the way of you feeling like, hey, I can interact with this person in a face-to-face way with nothing kind of in the way. And a lot of the times what comes up is like, it's often that social media, video games, YouTube is like a nice escape for kids who are feeling overwhelmed. And like what we are hearing a lot from families right now, and it makes sense because I think a lot of adults in this past couple of years since the pandemic, it's been a really overwhelming time. And we're still kind of feeling the ripple effects of that. And our kids are still feeling the ripple effects of that. Um, and so as they're navigating sort of these different developmental stages, we're seeing them try to find the coping tools that are easily accessible, are being socially mirrored to them. Like, my friends are doing this, you know, my older siblings are doing this. Like, this is how I know to entertain myself when I'm feeling bored or overwhelmed. This is what I can do when I'm feeling stressed about school. I can go do this thing. Um, and like Dr. Christian was saying, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because on the one hand, yeah, like those are nice stress relieving activities in moderation. But what's kind of tricky about these things is they're really salient and they kind of make our brains just want more and more and more. And so we're not actually getting the soothing sort of benefits we initially think we're getting. Like it's an escape, but it's not actually relaxing. Um, and that's really tricky because it can feel like um, this is what I do when I want to decompress after a really long day at school. Like I just spent 8 hours of learning. Um, I want to do this thing that helps me feel like I can wind down a little bit. And really, it's kind of winding down some parts of the brain, but it's turning on other parts. And it's just this constant, like, I need more. And so there's not a lot of satiation despite sort of the desire for that. So a lot of times it's like, okay, what's the function of the use? What are they using? Um, and if it's always I'm going there because I'm upset, if it's I'm going there because I don't feel like I can connect in real life, like that starts to help. I think the adults in the child's life understand like what's missing here and how can we shift because we can't really solve the problem if we don't know what we're kind of solving. Um, so that's usually kind of the conversations that we're having. But I will be, you know, um, open too about like sometimes what brings a family in is like kiddo has started to make really risky choices online, like risky decisions, engaging in risky behavior, usually in more like adolescent period. And so again, it's like we're trying to help build these really real skills that in adolescence we do anyways. But it's tricky when it starts to translate to online use because like um, Dr. Pucci was saying, the online world is a little bit more permanent and the consequences can be very, very real, very fast, and it's really hard to put it back in the box. Um, so, sort of the stewardship of helping young people sort of navigate real questions that they have about real things that we all sort of start to be curious about at different ages. Um, but, knowing your kid and knowing like what they might be interested, if you're noticing that they're starting to look up things that are inappropriate or suggestive that they have questions about topics that again is a cue like we need to have a conversation about this, let's do it together so that you don't feel like you have to go um, somewhere online. So those are the types of things that I'm typically kind of working with, but it's expansive. So there's always different things, but yeah.
I'm going to open this question up for the panel. So wherever your brain takes you, please share with the class. Okay. What suggestions do you have for parents who want to now create rules or monitor their activity level and that has not happened before? And how should parents go about having this conversation? Okay, and then there's a segue to that. When should parents consider getting outside help? And what kind of help is available to them if this becomes a very disruptive problem? Not all at once.
I'm happy to take it, but I also know you had such a great answer before. Do you want to start, Kelly? Or
You can go ahead.
okay. So in terms of the first question, what suggestions do you have for parents who want to now create rules or monitor activity level? I think, it just really connects to what Kelly was speaking about in terms of early and often. So if you feel like it's okay if you're now you're like, oh, I didn't have that conversation as early as I wanted to. It's never too late to have those conversations. And I think starting the conversations also from a place of Well, there's two components to it. I think the first is like, you know, talking through with them what they're using, what they're getting out of it, what they like about it, some interest the same way you would something they're doing in real life. Like there's some value in that. Like what are they watching? If they're watching like a YouTube science guru and it's really interesting science experiments, sitting and watching a couple with them, as Kelly suggested, participating in it. But the piece about setting boundaries is much like having a conversation about curfew or something. They don't they don't get to negotiate for the time that you and or your partner, if you have one, decide upon. But the more honest we are about why we're setting the rule, and then also thinking ahead a little bit, well, I would say thinking ahead, like what kind of questions might come up and how to answer them thoughtfully about exactly what you were talking about. Like that the games are really, they're designed, games, social media, it's designed to keep you on there longer. And that this is an important, this is a family rule, this is a conversation that we'll continue to have, but that we find value in setting limits around blank, blank, blank. And we're gonna help you to make sure that we're all as a family abiding by that, but then also, as Kelly pointed out, making sure that we're also watching our own media use when we're with the kids. I'll let you also take
Sure.
a shot at it. Yeah.
Yeah. This was the thing where my mind went blank and I was like, oh, there's something else on this cool website. They actually have conversation starters pre-written for you. And they're specific for kids like younger than 12 to get going. So it's a good like dinner time conversation where you can just start like figuring out like, what do you get out of this? Like, what's the point of it? Let me tell you like why I have concerns about it, but also I'll tell you what I get out of it too. So there's some decent ways to kind of get this going. Um, I also think about, when you're planning out kind of like your media diet or your digital diet for a family, thinking about strategically putting that like video game or like YouTube time, like where they can then like trade up to something else, right? Like this is only on for 20 minutes because then we have to go to baseball practice. Or this is only on for 20 minutes and then we're going to go have dessert. And we don't watch TV in the dining room, or something. The idea is like the trading up can be beneficial. I mean, I think back when I was a kid, if the TV was on too long in the summer, my parents would always say, like, go do something better, right? Like, we're done with this. And it's kind of like what we have to do again. It's like we got to go do something different or better that's like a good use of their time. I'm not saying that's easy by any means, especially if you're busy yourself, like making dinner, doing dishes, tending to work stuff, or getting another kid ready for bed. But trying to be like as careful as you can with like, okay, when is this most appropriate? Because I think what you were talking about, like that right after school time, that's when they're exhausted. And so they're prone to just like continuing to hit the next video because like they don't have the willpower to stop, I guess, is kind of where they are. So if there's something else to kind of renew their attention, something physical, being strategic with the time is important. Um, yeah. And then it might be, like if there are things that you're not thrilled with, like their behavior, getting off the device, it's important to talk about that when when they're not on the device, but in separate time. Like, I know how much you love this and I'd like to have you keep doing it, but here are the rules, right? Like, and you're going to be that steady, calm parent that is there for them when they're upset too. I think that's the other hard part is not getting emotional yourself when your kid's like, ah, like falling apart. And you can like relieve them of that distress immediately by saying, okay, 5 more minutes. Um, I mean, I know I've done that before for sure. We're not all perfect, but like the idea is like you're just trying to be as consistent as possible is key. And if you're calm and steady and they see that you're not freaked out and that it's not a big deal to put the screen down, eventually they're like, fine. Like I do love that my kid is like, okay, I'm done when this time is done and we turn off the TV. It took a while to get there, but that like steady consistency helped like reduce like tantrums when getting off of things. Yeah. You want to add?
Oh, I would just say, because I happen to have kids in the age range that most of you are talking about, I think something else that's really helpful is when you're putting limits on the screen time, also like having alternative games, toys out. I find that my kids get easily, I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, one of each gender, and they get very easily overwhelmed if I just were to say something like, go to the playroom and find something to play with. They're like, I don't know, this all seems boring. But if I like strategically pull out, like, here's like the magnetiles you haven't played with this week that you usually love. Like, I'm thinking this in my head, but not saying it out loud. Magnetiles, coloring, a, a some kind of game, like 4 things to choose from. You'll be amazed at how quickly they'll gravitate to one of those, as opposed to something that's really broad, like just go find something in the basement or like, something of that nature. I'm not saying that like I do use the phrase like go play outside all the like often, but I find that that can be like a great segue, particularly for the younger kids that I know a lot in the audience have.
Anybody else?
I just wanted to add on to the addiction comment you made because I think, and like the coping tool, because like distraction is a good coping tool. It's one of many, right? So I wouldn't be hard on yourself about if you're hard on yourself about this. I'm not sure. It's really a challenge, I think, to kind of sort out like, is this healthy or unhealthy sometimes, especially when they're this young. But yeah. I think if it's something that, like, we always talk about if something's interfering or impacting your life, right, in a meaningful way. So now you've like shut yourself off from social experiences or other things. I know you mentioned your child's on the spectrum, so it kind of, you have a maybe a different way of trying to sort that out. But yeah, like if it's really interfering with like interactions with others, it's preventing them from learning and their education because they're like, I'm not doing homework, I'm not reading, I'm only doing this. Like those are things where it's now like kind of gotten out of hand. And when it's the sole way they regulate their feelings, like if it's the only way, then it's like, all right, we got to figure out other tools for you, buddy. Because you can't use a hammer to screw in a screw. So like, let's figure out other ideas for you. So that's where I would think get maybe some advice or support. There's a lot of like parent-led like support around this too, where like the child themselves doesn't necessarily have to go to like see a treatment provider to like give you bounce ideas off of them and see what might help or work. Yeah.
And don't be surprised. I anticipate that if you're implementing a new rule or new boundaries, like the behavior is going to increase, particularly, I mean, a strong-willed child, it will persist longer too. But for any child, we anticipate there's going to be a spike, like you're putting something new in place. They're going to test the limit of how serious that is. And also it's going to take them time to get used to it. So anticipate some of that. Don't be surprised or startled when that happens. And to Kelly's point, if that's persisting now, like, gosh, we've had this boundary in place for now weeks, and like, it's the same boundary. I keep doing it the same way, and it's still not getting better. Like, they're still having meltdowns every time I take the technology. That would be like a warning sign that, like, gosh, they're really struggling to adjust to a new boundary, and they're using it maybe in an unhealthy way.
I'm just going to add really quick. I think there was a submitted question around ways to limit distractions on a laptop when your child has to do their homework on like a thing. So I have some programs that I can share, and I'll share it so it goes out with the slides. But yeah, I'll send them and like with a little description because there are things that can limit your time and what periods of time you can access your devices. And then there are other ways to reduce like distractions so that you're not mindlessly like, let me read about Prince Harry when I'm supposed to be writing my paper, like that kind of thing. So
Guys,
Thank you guys. Thanks for joining us.